Spain in the 1930s, a country torn apart. The air smelled of blood and fear, the streets thundered with gunfire, and millions of people didn't know if they would wake up the next morning. But behind all this chaos lay much more horrific and sinister secrets. Why was Moscow in Spain? Simply to help allies or to pull off the scam of the century? Where did hundreds of tons of Spanish gold disappear to? And why do the Kremlin archives remain silent on this topic to this day? And the most terrible thing is, all these events became prototypes for future USSR operations in other countries. Spain in the 1930s of the 20th century resembled a powder keg ready to explode at any moment. The country was literally bursting at the seams from poverty, social contradictions, and constant infighting between the left and right forces. Anarchists, Marxists, and communists were in vogue, constantly stirring up trouble and reinforcing their agitation with mass protests, armed uprisings, terrorist acts, and the destruction of ideological opponents. Of course, they acted largely with the help of Stalin and the Kremlin, which began its dirty political game in this distant European country. After all, as in many other countries around the world, the mix of ideas prevailing then was well described by the Soviet publicist Ilya Ehrenberg in a sketch about southern Spain. In a small Andalusian town, he witnessed a heated argument between a teacher and the mayor. The teacher was a supporter of the Third International, i.e. a communist. The mayor, of the Second International, i.e. a socialist. Suddenly, a farm laborer intervened in the dispute. "And I am for the First International, for Comrade Miguel Bakunin." It was about Mikhail Bakunin, the Russian revolutionary and founder of anarcho-collectivism. This is an excellent example of what was going on in the minds of Spaniards at that time. All this led to various groups and political forces ruling the country in the 30s. Some demanded an immediate proletarian revolution according to Soviet recipes. Others wanted the restoration of the monarchy, abolished in 1931. Still others advocated for fascism in the Italian style. The Spaniards divided into several camps that could no longer and did not want to negotiate peacefully. In 1936, the left-wing Popular Front won in Spain, a coalition of political forces inspired by the books of Marx and Lenin. After coming to power under the slogans of land nationalization, peasants, not waiting for reforms, rushed to seize fields uncontrollably. About 50,000 frightened landowners fled to neighboring Portugal, perfectly understanding how collectivization in the USSR had ended. In the summer of the same year, supporters of the Popular Front shot one of the prominent opposition figures. The situation escalated to the limit. Frightened by the rapid spread of Marxist ideas and the general chaos, the military began preparing for an armed coup against the left Republican government. Interestingly, initially, the military leader of the nationalists was General José Sanjurjo. At the time of the mutiny, he was in exile in Portugal. On July 20th, he flew to the territory controlled by the nationalists, but he was in such a hurry to present himself to his comrades in a ceremonial manner that he overloaded his small biplane with suitcases of dress uniforms. The plane crashed, and the military leader died. The pilot saw that there were too many suitcases and warned the passenger, but he replied, "I must be dressed in the best clothes, as befits the new ruler of Spain." That is, the coup had not even begun. Power had not yet been won, and he was already dressing in government clothes and went to another world with them. After this incident, the uprising was led by a new general, 46-year-old Francisco Franco. Unlike other military men, he did not belong to any right-wing party, but he categorically opposed communists and communist Spain, as he hated all the teachings of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. He constantly said that they, the military, had risen to save the fatherland from chaos and prevent the creation of a communist republic. In this difficult situation on July 25th, in his first radio address to the nation, he explained the necessity of a military coup. Therefore, it is beyond doubt that it is necessary to either side with Moscow and sacrifice Spain and its Christian civilization, or to start a crusade for a great, mighty, and beloved fatherland. Spain will forever remain free from this horror when an honest Spanish worker is deceived and used to carry out Moscow's plans. General Franco appealed for help to Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Both Hitler and Mussolini, intending to turn him into their puppet, sent soldiers, weapons, and military equipment, armored vehicles, and even aircraft to Spain. This immediately strengthened the rebels, because rifles are rifles, but when you have heavy armament behind you, everything changes dramatically. In turn, the Popular Front requested support from Moscow and was surprised to hear the answer. "We cannot help you, as we are part of the Non-Intervention Committee in Spanish Affairs." This was a cynical and hypocritical game on Stalin's part, as the Kremlin satrap never paid attention to any committees. He was simply waiting for the right moment and bargaining, because he understood that good profit could be extracted from this war. The coup began in the summer, and a secret meeting took place in Moscow at the end of September. It was decided to carry out an operation codenamed X and send military advisors and special equipment to Spain, as well as allocate 1,000 rubles and 190,000 US dollars for these purposes. But while Stalin was bargaining, the Soviet intelligence informed him that the head of the Spanish government was going to make an offer to the USSR that is hard to believe even now, to transfer the national gold reserves, which amounted to 510 tons out of the 635 available. The reason was that the rebel forces were advancing on the capital, and so that national treasures do not fall into the hands of the rebels. Let's give them to our allies. Let the ingots and coins wait out the difficult times. And when everything calms down, we'll return them, because this kind and honest ruler of the Kremlin cannot deceive us. There was a lot of gold, because it is known that throughout the centuries, since the time of Columbus and Cortez, Spain had waged wars of conquest, in particular robbing Central and South America. The Republicans understood that if even 1 ton of metal fell into the hands of the rebels, they would use it to buy a huge amount of weapons, ammunition, and food, everything necessary for waging war. If they get 100 tons, the rebels will become invincible. And if all the gold, then what? It's better to take it far from sin and take it to Moscow. So, officially, preserve the gold. Madrid appealed to Moscow with a request to preserve the country's national reserves in October 1936. The entire process was personally supervised by the resident of Soviet intelligence in Spain, Alexander Orlov. There was so much precious metal that over several nights it was loaded onto 4 merchant ships, Neva, Kursk, Volgolets, and the ship of the Communist Youth International. They sailed out with a 1-day interval. Each ship was escorted by the fleet of the Spanish Republic. Of course, everything was done in strict secrecy. According to the Russian intelligence defector Viktor Suvorov, it was this special operation that marked the beginning of the history of the main intelligence directorate of the Russian Federation. Information has been preserved that the precious metal and ancient coins were packed into 7,800 boxes. The route of the gold caravan was carefully planned in advance. First, the secret cargo was delivered to Odessa, Ukraine. There it was loaded onto a special train and transported to Moscow under enhanced guard. There it was hidden in the basements of the People's Commissariat of Finance. It is claimed that as soon as all this arrived in the White Stone City, Stalin was in an excellent mood. He organized a luxurious banquet, and at a Politburo meeting in January 1937, he declared, "The Spaniards will no longer see their gold and currency reserves as their own ears." If all the boxes with gold that we unloaded in Odessa were placed side by side on the cobblestones of Red Square, they would occupy it entirely, said one of the participants in that special operation. Already in Moscow, the gold began to be accounted for and described. As mentioned, along with the ingots, many rare gold coins were found. Some had high numismatic value, which often exceeded the cost of the metal they were made of. But Soviet specialists refused to take this into account, and even rare coins were valued simply by weight, like scrap metal. By the way, even then, both sides understood perfectly well. It was not about storage, but about a guarantee for future military supplies, and that returning the gold would be difficult and probably impossible. In the end, that's what happened. For a long time, no one knew about the fate of the gold reserves of the Bank of Spain. Why? It's very simple. The NKVD began to liquidate everyone who had any connection with the operation, so that from the outside, it seemed as if the person had died of illness or an accident. Let me remind you, those were the times of peak terror, when the Kremlin annihilated not only its own citizens, but also political enemies all over the world. So there was nothing surprising about this. Some were liquidated secretly, others fell under the steamroller of Stalin's repressions. For example, the Soviet ambassador to Spain, Marcel Israelievich Rosenberg, was shot in 1937. The USSR trade representative in Madrid, Artur Stashevsky, in 1938. The same fate befell many functionaries who had any connection with Spain at that time. NKVD officer Alexander Orlov, who supervised the transportation of the cargo from beginning to end, realized in time that nothing good awaited him at home and fled abroad. More precisely, he refused to return to the Union after receiving the appropriate order. As a result, he ended up in the United States, where he published several articles in magazines. Later, after Koba's death, they were included in the book The Secret History of Stalin's Crimes, which became a world bestseller. In fact, it was there that he told about the fate of Spanish gold and much, much more. After Moscow took the gold out of Spain, it began to send military equipment and its own advisor specialists there, who were supposed to help the brother republicans defeat the rebels. Do not think that Stalin was so virtuous and ruined himself. No, he saw this country as another sphere of influence. The USSR sold its Spanish brethren everything, from planes and tanks to ammunition and spare parts. Moreover, the shipment of weapons began only after Madrid's official agreement on prices, which were several times higher than the actual market value. Yes, in any case, modern Russian historians assert. There was extreme cynicism when the Union charged even for outdated trophy weapons that had been in warehouses since the Civil War. Mostly, writes Oleg Shama in his article, military cargo was sent from Odessa. Then, through the Turkish Straits, the transport would disappear for several days in the Greek archipelagos. There, the ships were repainted. Their identification marks and names were changed, as well as the flags on the masts. Hostile Italy was bypassed at night. During the day, the crew changed clothes and strolled on deck in tropical hats, posing as tourists. Next, they were met by the Spanish port of Cartagena, controlled by the Republicans. Soviet military advisors were ordered to stay away from artillery fire so that the Non-Intervention Committee would not encounter captured officers, writes historian Antony Beaver. Ships crossing the Dardanelles and transporting weapons, tanks, and aircraft changed their appearance, name, and flag while anchored near one of the Aegean islands. False funnels or some superstructures were used to distort the silhouette. That is, even then, it was a typical hybrid special operation. We are not there. No one is there. This is the tactic that the Kremlin would later use in other countries. Photographs of captured or damaged Soviet tanks have survived, on which identification marks were cut off or painted over. By the way, if you are interested in this topic, I recommend watching our segment, Nobody Knows Secret Wars of the USSR. In it, we talk about military conflicts involving the Kremlin on different continents. Of course, the numbers vary, but during the Civil War, the Soviet Union supplied at least 650 aircraft, over 1,000 artillery pieces, tanks, machine guns, several torpedo boats, and almost 500,000 rifles to the Spanish. Thanks to the propaganda organized by the Kremlin, thousands of international brigades fighters went to Spain and took up arms to help the Spanish communists win the war. These were volunteers from various countries in Europe and America. Over time, they became an effective base for the USSR's agent network around the world. To be fair, I should add that Ukrainians from territories that were then part of Poland also participated in the Civil War on the side of the communists. They were prompted to do so by Polish communist propaganda, which served Moscow. Galicians and Volhynians formed a separate unit within the Polish brigade. Their commander, Stanislav Tomaszewicz, wrote that in Spanish villages and towns, the beautiful Ukrainian song is often heard. It is sung by the Taras Shevchenko Company. And during difficult marches, the battalion commander addresses the Shevchenko followers. Perhaps the Ukrainians will sing? Then a powerful song sounds, and the difficult march becomes easier. And again, even in this case, Moscow showed cynicism and self-interest. For example, NKVD agents were sent to Spain disguised as volunteers. In reality, it was a regular business trip for employees of the punitive security service. They did not participate in combat operations, but nevertheless, Madrid was billed for them. By January 25, 1938, 155 people were sent from the USSR to Republican Spain. The expenses amounted to $1,560,000. Volunteers who traveled at the state's expense. What could be more absurd, wrote Russian historian Vadim Telytsin. Now a few words about how the Bolsheviks created fake heroes from scratch during the Spanish Civil War. One of them was Emil Kleber, whose real name was Manfred Stern, who worked for Soviet military intelligence and was an employee of the Comintern. He led one of the international brigades and became a favorite of many newspapers. After all, Moscow propaganda invented a legend that he was from Austria, a citizen of Canada, that this person abandoned everything, but went to fight for communist ideals. He was simply called the savior of Madrid. Although in reality this savior was born in Bukovina and had no relation to Canada, his entire story from beginning to end was fabricated by Soviet special services. Later, Kleber was rewarded with arrest and sent to the Gulag, where the people's hero died of exhaustion. And now about what else, besides stealing gold and propaganda, Moscow distinguished itself by in Spain. Mainly by the cruelty and arbitrariness of the NKVD organs, because Stalin's terror, the peak of which occurred in 1937 and 1938, extended to Madrid and other Spanish cities. Challenging the legitimate Spanish authorities, Moscow's totalitarian secret service, as if at home, began sowing terror in the territory controlled by the Republican government. Special prisons were established in Madrid, Barcelona, and Valencia. Under the pretext of fighting hidden enemies, agents killed and abducted people. The NKVD became so powerful that its representatives managed to build a state within a state in Spanish territory. It was the Chekists who taught their Spanish colleagues to take victims for firewood and shoot them in the back of the head, so as not to waste energy on transportation and burial, as was always practiced in the USSR. The NKVD became so enraged that they shot everyone without exception. According to historians, the reason for a person's execution was not necessarily their connection with the rebels, but also, for example, their religiosity. A cross or symbol on the neck. Even wearing glasses was considered a sign of enemy affiliation. An interesting fact: if initially the NKVD persecuted nationalists, then it turned to its own. For example, the Popular Front included a rather large workers' party of Marxist unification, abbreviated as POM in Spanish. This political force was unlucky because its leader was, for some time, Trotsky's personal secretary, who, as is known, fell out of favor with Stalin. And so the NKVD destroyed not only the leader of the unified Marxists, but also their rank and file activists. Here's quite an interesting story. Writer George Orwell, the future author of the cult novel 1984, and then an unknown English publicist, was a left-wing romantic. He came to fight for the Republic and joined the combat units of POUM. And it was the Spanish Civil War that opened his eyes to the scale of the lies of the pro-Soviet communist press. Later he wrote, "In Spain, I first saw newspaper reports that had no relation not only to the facts, but even to what is understood as ordinary lies. One of the most terrible features of war is that propaganda, all the hysterical shouts, lies, and howls of hatred, comes from people who are not fighting." By the way, Orwell himself narrowly avoided arrest and miraculously managed to escape. The NKVD was already compiling a dossier on him. And it was during that period that he became a convinced anti-Soviet figure. In 1944, he wrote Animal Farm, an anti-Bolshevik message to the whole world, encrypting real characters and animal images: Napoleon, the pig is Stalin, Snowball the pig is Trotsky, Old Major is Lenin. Subsequently, the dystopian novel 1984 appeared, depicting a totalitarian society with a cult of personality. It is said that two landmark works owe much of their origin to Stalin's lies in Spain, which the author saw with his own eyes. And finally, the story of how the USSR abducted Spanish children during the Civil War. When the massacre began, to save children, many European countries began to accept them in numerous camps and boarding schools. France accepted about 20,000 children, Belgium 5,000, Great Britain 4,000. Less than 3,000 children were taken to the USSR, and while all states did this quietly and calmly, Moscow turned it into a large-scale propaganda campaign. It was presented as a triumph of international solidarity, although the real goal was different: to raise a future socialist elite from loyal children. Simply put, to raise communist zombies, because instead of childhood, the children received ideological brainwashing. Another interesting detail: under the influence of sweet and false promises, the little ones, like the gold, were stolen, because many managed to return home not at the end of the war, but only after Stalin's death. Dear parents, My whole life here is constant suffering and hunger. I will play my last card. I will illegally escape from this country or go to prison. If everything works out, we will see each other soon. And if I'm not lucky, don't cry, but hate dictatorships of all kinds more strongly," wrote Pedro Cepeda, a 25-year-old Spaniard from Moscow in early January 1948. It was his 11th year of life in the USSR. Like many others deported by the communists at the time, he wanted to break free from the communist empire, but could not. In a letter to his parents, Cepeda mentioned his younger brother Rafael. In 44, during the famine, he was caught stealing something edible, and he ended up in prison. He was released in 46, but then he could play again. And so, in January 1948, Pedro Cepeda could not know that he would never see his brother again, because the latter would be liquidated in one of the Soviet prisons. This was the socialist paradise for Spanish children. Of course, an analogy with stolen Ukrainian children suggests itself. In general, this story deserves a separate episode. If you are interested, write to us. After all, besides Spanish children, there were also Korean, Hungarian, and Romanian children who were cynically used by communist authorities for their own purposes. Despite the USSR's help, General Franco won the Spanish Civil War. The Republicans capitulated. No one returned a single ingot of gold. After the end of the war, Moscow surrendered and cynically stated that everything had been spent on weapons. Let me remind you, we are talking about 510 tons. No one knows where they are now or who received them. Modern researchers put forward various versions about the further fate of Spanish treasures. Some claim that the gold was remelted and mixed with Soviet reserves, becoming indistinguishable from them. Others believe that a significant portion of the precious metal was secretly sold on international markets to finance Soviet projects around the world. Still others suggest that the gold is still stored in secret depositories, possibly even on Russian territory. There is a version that part of the Spanish gold was used to create the gold reserves of the socialist countries of Eastern Europe after World War II. Some historians point to strange coincidences in the increase of the USSR's gold reserves precisely during the period after the Spanish events. Interestingly, attempts by Spanish authorities of different periods to obtain information about the fate of national gold have invariably met with a wall of silence. Soviet and then Russian archives meticulously conceal documents related to this operation. Even today, almost 90 years later, the topic of Spanish gold remains one of the most classified pages of 20th century history. The families of those who participated in the operation are still afraid to talk about what they know from their ancestors. The operation to transport Spanish gold became a prototype for many future Soviet ventures. The scheme proved so effective that it was subsequently used in other countries around the world. Under the guise of fraternal assistance, the USSR repeatedly pumped resources from Allied states. The Spanish case showed that a totalitarian regime is capable of grand thefts under the guise of ideology and political necessity. This story became a lesson for future generations on how easily national wealth can be lost by trusting false promises. Today, 510 tons of gold would be worth tens of billions of dollars. But it's not just about money. Along with the metal, a part of Spanish history, cultural heritage accumulated over centuries, disappeared. Ancient coins, each a witness to eras, turned into faceless ingots. Francoist Spain, after the war, repeatedly tried to reclaim the stolen gold through diplomatic channels. All attempts ended in nothing. The USSR invariably cited that the metal was spent on military aid to the Republicans. The paradox of the situation was that this aid turned out to be useless. The Republicans still lost the war, and the gold disappeared forever. It turns out that the Spanish people paid a huge price for the defeat of their own supporters. The story of Spanish gold became a symbol of communist cynicism and greed. It showed the true face of a regime that covered up its selfish interests with beautiful slogans about international solidarity and the fight against fascism. This operation ushered in an era of hybrid wars, where the state formally does not participate in the conflict but actively influences its outcome. The methods developed in Spain were subsequently used in many regions of the world. Spanish gold forever remains a reminder of how easily national wealth can be lost by trusting false promises of a totalitarian regime. This story teaches us to be cautious with those who offer help in exchange for temporary storage of the most valuable things.